Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the audience, our esteemed panelists, and my fellow commissioners. I'm absolutely honored to be your facilitator today on this important and topical public dialogue hosted by the Presidential Climate Commission on industrial development strategies to give effect to the just transition. My name is Sharmini Harrington. I am one of the commissioners on the PCC, as we call it, bringing a business constituent view, working on the just transition. Given my business experience, I'm quite keen to actually hear from our esteemed panelists and what they think needs to be done to get industrial policy to support the just transition. As we pull back on fossil fuel sectors, it's critically important that we grow new sectors that are suitable for the low carbon future. So today, this event looks to examine salient issues around industrial development, such as the major shifts that are anticipated, the development of new economic clusters, improving competitiveness of the South African economy in the context of the transition, and of course, spurring innovation in the green economy. The discussion will aim to inform the design of the Just Transition Implementation Plan currently under development within the PCC. So today we have an esteemed list of panelists. I'm going to go through their CVs and introduce them. And thereafter, I'm going to go into the session itself with some context setting for myself. And then I'm going to open up to the panelists. Please feel free to list your questions in the Q&A box. I will try to weave them in the conversation or bring you into the floor so you may ask them as well. So with that, let's move to the panelists. Who do we have here today? So we've got Joanne Bate, who is one of my fellow commissioners and also the Chief Operations Officer of the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. In this role, Joanne plays a central role in the creation of a balanced and sustainable economic growth at a time when there's urgent need to sustainably expand South Africa's economy. We also have Professor Nimrod Zalk, who is a development economist focused on green industrialization and development finance in Africa, with over 20 years of experience in industrial development, trade, and development finance. That brings me to another fellow commissioner, Princess Sakani Nkambule. She is a PCC commissioner, an entrepreneur, an experienced community builder, motivational speaker, and best-selling author. She serves in leadership roles in numerous community, government, and business organizations throughout the country. We also have Charles Harding, who's the CEO of Impact Catalyst, an initiative that creates mechanisms that drive large-scale socioeconomic development initiatives through public-private partnerships. Then we have Professor Inglesi Lotz, who is a professor at the Department of Economics in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Raula's research focuses on energy and environmental issues, seeking answers to pressing issues associated with traditional ways of consuming and generating energy. Last but not least, we have Gaelo Monmosan Claire, who is a senior economist at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, or TIPS as we know it. He leads TIPS work on sustainability and the just transition. He's also the facilitator for the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, the Industrialization Plan for South Africa's renewable energy value chain. So today, we have these panelists. We're going to ask them to shed some light on what needs to be done to get this going from industrial policy perspectives. But first, I'd like to just set the scene a little bit. Many of you don't know what the PCC is about and when we were created. So let me bring a little bit of that context and then we can open up to the panel. So the Presidential Climate Commission is a multi-stakeholder body established by the President. The PCC stems from the Jobs Summit in 2018, at which social partners expressed concern about the jobs impact of the climate transition. So already in 2018, this discussion was rife. Stakeholders expressed the need for an independent advisory body to chart the path towards net zero and a climate resilient economy in a socially just manner. The Commission includes many government ministers. The Commission also has representatives from local government, business, labor, civil society, youth, faith, and science organizations. This means that the Commission is by its very nature a social compacting organization. We discuss issues frankly, and we come to consensus views on matters. We, of course, don't think we represent the full sum of total of society. This is why when we are formulating recommendations, we consult at length with different stakeholders and listen to their views, similar to what we're doing today. We're looking to gather views and then shape our thinking and consult on these. This gives rise to a series of events that the Commission is undertaking on pertinent issues relevant to the just transition. In 2022, Cabinet approved the Just Transition Framework, which provides an overarching frame to guide the transition in the years ahead. This framework sets the shared vision for a just transition for the country, the principles to guide the transition, and the key policy areas to give effect to the just transition. At the request of Cabinet, the PCC is now developing a just transition implementation plan, which will provide further specifics on the role of various actors in the transition and the timing thereof. A key pillar of the just transition is, of course, industrial development. New economic clusters will be needed to create new jobs and replace jobs where they may be lost. Rising numbers of small and informal business are also critical for a more climate resilient and equitable economy. It is in this context that the PCC is pleased to convene thought leaders and experts to examine salient issues around industrial policy, such as the major shifts that are anticipated, the development of new economic clusters, improving competitiveness of the South African economy in the context of the transition, and of course, last but not least, spurring innovation in the green economy. So with that context, I now want to invite each of my panelists to share some of their opening remarks about what they think is needed in the South African economy to tackle the just transition as well as socioeconomic development. I'm first going to ask Joanne. Joanne, please share some of your thoughts around these critical issues that we are grappling with. Joanne?
Thanks so much, Shamini. And I think to start with, I always feel like I need to give our perspective on what industrialization actually means, because I do find that the conversation to date has been very much around energy decarbonization as opposed to green industrialization. And green industrialization is not limited to green industries that support energy decarbonization. We have, as everyone knows, a 25-year timeline through which we can achieve through which we aim to achieve our NDCs. But we actually have an economic cliff in the next 10 years if we don't rapidly decarbonize our industrial pathways, specifically export pathways. So a lot needs to be done within industry to ensure that the transition is just, that jobs within our traditional manufacturing sectors are supported and sustained, and that we actually grow the jobs that are going to allow us to reindustrialize the economy as well as become a far greater export partner in the green economy. I believe there is significant policy adjustments that need to take place. We need to relook at the level of incentives possible in order to incentivize companies to decarbonize. We need to look at the balance of the carrot and the stick. Our carbon taxes have not been aggressively implemented for good reason, because we have an economy to protect. But it is definitely a means through which we can assist in driving green industrialization. And to me, what is critically required over and above policy is a different way of thinking around the green economy and these clusters that you talk to. So we do need to look at new economic clusters. It doesn't deprioritize Gauteng, which is a critical economic cluster from a decarbonization perspective. So I think significant growth and opportunity in decarbonization of the industries based in Gauteng. But we have clusters that have been, I think of the Coega economic zone. The potential of the Coega economic zone has never really been unlocked. And we really do have an opportunity to both diversify economic activity away from Durban Port by expanding capacity at Coega Port and creating a green node there, not only off the back of green hydrogen production or green ammonia production, but also the auto sector, which feeds into our new energy vehicles, and really thinking around the green cluster and manufacturing product that can be developed within that cluster, the Saldanha cluster, the Northern Cape cluster. So we need to start, I think, more than policy, we need to look at integrated planning to ensure that we understand how these clusters can develop in order to ensure that infrastructure costs are shared amongst multiple projects, that skills are created en masse, that social and community matters are dealt with by a collective of companies rather than an individual company. So more than policy, or rather in addition to policy, I believe we need a new way of thinking and planning in order to take advantage of what is probably the largest reindustrialization opportunity that the country has seen. So I think very exciting. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Joanne. Yeah, and I agree. I think we have huge opportunity. I think there's definitely opportunities in South Africa. I want to touch on that when we come back. I just want to bring in Professor Zalk. So Nimrod, share some of your thoughts around what is needed to get this going in South Africa, and maybe what some of the opportunities are that we see. Thanks, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Shamini, and morning to all the other panelists and everybody who's participating. I think there are a few points to be made. The first is that for the just energy transition to succeed, I think it really needs to have widespread social legitimacy. And I think there are two very obvious areas in which that social legitimacy needs to be established. The first is in the creation of jobs. And the second is in the provision of reliable and affordable electricity supply. And that's really important because I think it's required from a political economy perspective to create the space to undertake some of the longer term adaptation and mitigation measures, which are going to take time, and their economic benefits are not going to necessarily manifest themselves in the short term. I'm thinking here about things like hard to abate sectors which would benefit from transition to green hydrogen. I'll try and say a little bit more about that just now. And I'm going to focus on where I think some of the employment opportunities are, because the provision of, or the rollout of reliable and affordable electricity to low-income households is a much broader issue than one of industrialization. So what role can industrialization play? I think that first of all, there are some obvious and direct ways in which industrialization can contribute to employment creation. One is around the deepening of domestic manufacturing of components that feed into the now very substantial pipeline of solar PV and wind projects, and also the shift from internal combustion to new energy vehicles. But I think we also need to be cautious and be realistic in understanding that these are unlikely to, in and of themselves, replace the jobs that would be destroyed in the coal-based energy value chain. It's not as simple as a kind of one-for-one replacement of a coal job with a job directly in these kind of sectors. So what are the broader opportunities and imperatives? First, I think we need to broaden our definition of industrialization to include sectors that can create significant numbers of jobs, while also adding value and limiting CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. top of the list, undoubtedly, I would say we need a much greater focus on high-value agriculture. In other words, horticultural, expanding our horticultural industry, which actually is a great but under-recognized economic success story of South Africa. And that's particularly products like citrus and deciduous fruits, avocados, nuts, and so forth. These involve a combination of sophisticated farming techniques that have a lot of, but also have a lot of labor intensity, and include practices that economize on scarce water through practices like precision irrigation, and also I think could readily be converted to things like agrivoltaic energy systems. Secondly, the expansion of relatively low emission, labor intensive and medium technology manufacturing industries like clothing and footwear, food and beverages, metals and plastic fabrication. And these kind of sectors can benefit from the insertion of greener or cleaner technologies, which include rooftop solar power generation, for instance, but also resource efficiency and other circular economy practices. So let me just take one step backwards. I forgot to mention this in terms of broadening the definition of industrialization. I think what's also very critical to pay attention to is that there is this tremendous opportunity now to expand parts of mining, what I call the climate smart parts of mining that produce the critical minerals that are necessary for the green transition, and as far as possible, looking at ways that we can build those value chains through to value-added products. The very big challenge, although also a longer-term opportunity, is in relation to the hard-to-abate heavy industries like steel and aluminium and chemicals, so forth. These are going to take time and need a lot of restructuring to make the shift from coal to cleaner energy basis, particularly around green hydrogen. If a shift to green hydrogen is successfully implemented, then there would be enormous employment creation benefits, particularly if we target sectors with the strongest value chain linkages. So a couple of examples here for me would be things like green iron and steel, where South Africa could position itself with an advantage in making fabricated metal products out of green iron and steel. Another example would be, for instance, green aviation fuel that positions us as a favorable long-haul destination to attract tourists, not just in fact to South Africa, but also perhaps to the Southern African region. Too many issues and too little time, so let me stop there. So thanks.
Well, thanks for that, Nimrod. I think you've given us good food for thought on these many opportunities, because they do exist. I do want to now move to Charles and change tact a little bit. Given what we've heard from Nimrod and Joanne, we see opportunities here. But it's really what's needed to get this off the ground. Coming from a perspective of public-private partnerships, is this something that can be expanded and utilized more? And how do we do it? So maybe share some of your thoughts as well, Charles. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. So I think I would like to start by saying is that we're in a space of competing priorities. So if you start listening to different role players or stakeholders in the space, everybody has the specific view, whether that's from a political perspective, from a very socialistic perspective or capitalistic perspective, from a large-scale economic-driven transition to supporting SMEs, and balancing the act between economic growth and social empowerment. And these things are actually all very difficult. It creates a very complex space. And it's not to say that everybody is wrong in terms of what they believe, but it becomes tricky because there's actually a middle ground between all of these things, between stakeholders. You can create a portfolio of interventions that is either large scale, and policy can enable that, and then you can create a portfolio of interventions that supports SMEs, and policy can support the SMEs. What we try to do is we try to fit everything into one big framework, rather than creating an enabling environment where we have a portfolio and conversations and a common narrative of how we can get there collectively, taking these different perspectives into consideration. And that's why I think in many cases you see these different stakeholders pulling into different directions and nobody taking hands, because nobody's actually tying these things together to create one single narrative of where we're going as a country, as South Africa incorporated, rather than having different people pulling in different directions. And it's important that we have different views, but somewhere in a national interest, we need to start converging into something that says we as South Africa, this is what we are doing. Yes, we understand the different narratives, but this is the best way of mitigating and reducing the complexity by working together into a common plan. So it links up to what Joanne is saying, is that we need a large-scale integrated plan that actually supports the whole transition process. Currently, planning is done in different ways, and if you look at how governmental planning is done, and I've been involved in that space for a very long time, and how industry plans are very different, and these two entities never plan together. If you start looking at a large-scale integrative plan of the type of intervention that we need to do, if we look at the economic value of this just transition plan. So usually when you start doing any big project, any good program manager or project manager will give you a thumbs up that says 10 to 20% of this large scale project is going to be just planning and design, because you have to design it. It's not going to happen by itself. It is going to happen by a large scale design process. If 10 to 20% of a large-scale project goes into planning and design, then why are we struggling to actually allocate funding to actually start with the planning process? So every time planning is raised, planning is one of those things that actually never funded. It just has to happen by itself. And this whole grand-scale industrialization and decarbonization actually requires a grand-scale design. It is sometimes really, if I may use an analogy to say, well, I used an analogy the other day to say, well, if you're going to build a building, you have to get an engineer. You can't get everybody in the community to come and actually design and build a building without some sort of engineer that actually coordinates this process and coordinate the needs of everybody in terms of understanding what they want to do, how they want to prosper, and then add all of that into the design of building, but he's still an engineer. And sometimes what we do is, from this analogy, we say, well, we're going to build a building, and then everybody puts up their hands and we wait for somebody to design a building, but it's not going to happen by itself. You actually need to do it very, very deliberately. So in terms of what we're seeing in terms of our partners and different stakeholders is that everybody has this big need to have the common understanding of what we're going to do. And there's this big gap that needs to be filled through some sort of grand planning and design that is not always government-led. And I think sometimes we actually leave planning just to government. But I think it is something that we sometimes have to think slightly differently. And I think that's also what Joanne said in terms of the different mindset. Rather than government saying, well, we're going to build a lot of SEZs and we're going to put them here because we think this is where the need is. Maybe a different mindset is to say, well, ask the investors to say, well, if you can pick where we put up a SEZ, where would you pick it to create the biggest investment or to allocate your investment to it? So it's a different way of doing it, but sometimes we are stuck in the way that we plan that we are not creative in terms of what we do. And that comes back also to, I think, what has been said about innovation. We cannot industrialize. If you start looking at all the large-scale programs in our country, and the big localization efforts, if you start looking at things like the defense industry, the localization of the 1064 rail in locomotives, localization in the maritime industry, the biggest constraint has always been intellectual property. We do not have sufficient and intellectual property right TRL levels to commercialize, for example, for some of the renewable energy technologies, which means that we're always going to manufacture under license. And then we're always going to basically beat the drum to somebody else's intellectual property that they own. So if you want to really industrialize, I think this grand scale plan needs to include how do we actually do innovation to actually create more intellectual property to pump into the industry, so that we actually start building our own industries. And through that planning process, it might also be that it is not a switch. Intellectual property is not a switch that you switch on and off. It takes years, which means that you need to have a long-term roadmap to say, well, great, we are going to manufacture, for example, under license, but in 5 years' time, our policies is going to be ready so that we can actually incorporate our intellectual property into that factory that already exists. So we do more of our own. But these roadmaps are very really actually done. And in most cases, when you talk about localization and you start talking about the long-term view of localization and industrialization, people actually they want to have this light switch that you switch on and off, and that is not how you're going to build this country. You need a long-term plan, and long-term plan goes past, unfortunately, political windows, which means that you have to have a long-term plan that has a 10 to 20-year window that everybody buys into, industry and government, and that everybody drives in a very competitive and transparent process. I think the last thing that I just wanted to mention is that in many of these things is that, as I'm stating, is that we have to work together as government and industry, and I think it is imperative. But we cannot change the way that we do things if we're not willing to change ourselves. So we are busy with a large-scale change management process, which means that we all have to change. We cannot go into this industrialization process or decarbonization process with the same government that we had previously. As example, we cannot go into this as the same industry that we had before, because industry also has to decarbonize and they have to be a bit more agile as organizations. So which means that we need to do some self-reflection in terms of how we change, and how we are going to move into something new so that we enable change, because we can't sit back and say, but everybody else must change, but we are going to remain the same. That's not how you do change management. We have to, as part of this journey of change management and planning and rollout and implementation, manage that change management process very carefully. And with that, we're going to have to find better ways of working together as triple Ps. If you sit in conversations around the just transition, a lot of the conversations is, how does industry give a SOE or government money to do the job? And maybe we need to change narrative to say, well, how do we give the money into an entity that creates investor confidence, and that entity can be co-owned by industry and by government, and create new triple Ps and new type of business models and structures that enables investor confidence to move forward. But we cannot go into the space with the same business models and the same approaches that we've had for the last 10, 20 years and think we are going to operate differently. We actually have to be completely different. And to do that, we're going to have to chart a map of progress for ourselves to say, well, how do we as organizations, or we as government change, and what capabilities do we need to change? And what is the future capabilities to drive this process? Thank you.
Thanks, Charles, for those thoughts. Lots of intriguing concepts of thinking differently. So we'll probe that a little bit more just now. I want to bring the next speaker in, my fellow commissioner, Sakani. Please, can you come through and share your thoughts, please?
Thank you, Shamini. Good morning to my fellow panelists and those who have joined this session. I think from what everyone has said, it's very, very evident that changing climate conditions will affect movement, people, will affect the volume and the value of trade. But at the same time, a shift in trade can also help protect people, can protect ecosystems, and also protect our economy. In terms of what needs to be done, definitely, I think the first question for today is how do we shift our trade policy so that it is fit for purpose? We're able to grow the economy, we're able to create jobs and maintain whatever jobs that we have. I think it's important that we look at domestic trade policy measures. What is it that we can do at that level? I think Joan has already mentioned the issue of subsidies. I think we are challenged as a country now. If you now just think of the recently announced austerity measures, which might, pose a real challenge in terms of that of that aspect. I think what comes to mind is the automotive industry. As you're all aware, that 90% of emissions come from buses and trucks. Then how do we transform public transport? And for us to do that, it therefore means that the production plants should be completely overhauled. And what the industry is saying is that they need to be subsidized, like in other developed countries. And I'm not sure if that particular subsidy is going to work. But the other thing that we can look into as well, we can also look into tariffs. How do we stimulate investment for renewable energy products by using tariffs at the correct level? But that tariff at the same time should be such that those products are still affordable to the poor. Government can also use its procurement plan to ensure that there's more investment in clean energy. And I think that's one aspect that government has not, maybe it's there in terms of theory, but it's something that government can look into more detail, as that will also assist as part of our domestic trade policy measures. Charles also spoke about the intellectual property. As a country, we have to develop our own, and we need to be assisted by government to protect that, especially from up and coming entrepreneurs, because without our own intellectual property, it means we're not be able to move fast enough in terms of the transition. Any shift has to be, along structural, social, and institutional. Maybe let me just look at social. Obviously, we're talking about protecting vulnerabilities. We're talking about ensuring that the vulnerable, the youth, the women are protected. I think we, as a country, we need to engage in more dialogue to foster more communication amongst everyone. Obviously, that will include the communities themselves, government, civil society, private sector. Because I think where we are, we have not been able to get a proper buy-in in terms of everyone that is involved in particular communities. And just maybe a quick comment on formation of new clusters. Joanne mentioned the SEZs, which are very critical, and ensuring that we create new economic clusters away from Gauteng. But at a local level as well, I think we need to ensure that in communities get organized in a manner that will promote collective action. Communities need to be helped to form cooperatives, and that will address the needs and the concern of that particular community, whether it be the production of food or any other that they need, obviously using the new technologies. So I think there is more that needs to be done at the community level, because I don't think there's enough that has been done to encourage those new economic clusters within the communities. Because you can in many communities you need to encourage the formation of your micro and small businesses, and taking into account that if you now look into small enterprises, most of them by their very nature, their investment in technology is very low for various reasons. Some of them do not have information. Obviously, they do not have the financial resources. They do not have the expertise. So for me, that also brings another framework that can also assist us in our shift, where as a country, we look into the international framework. How do we collaborate with other countries? How do we strengthen that so that there's broader policy integration as well as information sharing and capacity building that will assist those in communities that ordinarily would not have access or the resources to use new technology. So I think those are my initial thoughts. There's a lot to be said, but I think let me stop there. Thank you, Shamini.
Thanks, Tsakani. I think you're bringing a different perspective of how to actually encourage this change, taking from the lessons learned from before and how do we move forward. So we'll dive into that also a little bit more. Let's bring in the rest of the panelists. So we've got Gaylo up next. Please, can you share some of your opening remarks, please?
Yeah, thanks so much, Shamini, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I think when we think about, sort of the green industrial policy transition and the green industrialization transition, there's a few questions that we need to ask ourselves. First is, what are we talking about? And we have to first recall that, look, this is an economy-wide transition. This is a society-wide transition. There's only one economy. And that means, yes, developing new industries, like renewable energy. But effectively, it also means, and probably primarily means, decarbonizing and transitioning existing industries, the sort of 99% of the economy. And often we limit ourselves too much to that first component of saying, well, we need to create new industries, but they're not operating in a vacuum. And then thirdly, of course, it's about making that transition inclusive through just transition. And that means investment in, things like services, education, health, and transport. Then we have to ask ourselves, does it make sense? And where does it make sense? what are the opportunities that make sense in our context? What are our niches that we are competitive with? And that is a question that often I think we don't ask ourselves. You know, we see a trend globally and we, oh, we got to do it. Well, that's not because it's happening globally that we should be doing it. You know, are we competitive in something? And often it's clear that if we look past maybe one of those trendy technologies or product demand trends, and we look beyond that and look within the value chains at what we could say maybe some of the less, you know, sexy opportunities, then actually there's a business, you know, and there's a market case for us to invest. And I think we need to really start interrogating this a lot more strongly, and find our niches in those various value chains and understand where it makes sense, so that we don't just jump, you know, into an opportunity and then end up spending a lot of resources, both from the public and the private sector, into something that probably doesn't make sense. It's also relevant, by the way, when it comes to geographies, you know, and we mustn't equate need with opportunity. And I think this is really important. I also felt like, say, well, there's a massive need for investment in whatever sector, you know, renewable energy, water, sanitation, transport. And we think, well, that's an opportunity. I wish it were the case, to be honest. But sadly, certainly on the African continent, need doesn't mean opportunity. You know, it means there's a latent demand, but that's often, and more often than not, does not translate into actual demand. And you know, we need to do a lot more to create that demand, certainly. And similarly, you know, it's not because there is need for massively investing in certain communities, particularly our coal-based communities, that it always makes sense to do everything there. You know, and I think we need to reckon with that. That often, you know, investors look at other geographies before they look at some of those communities that we want to push investment into. And so that means that if it doesn't make direct sense, then we need particular interventions, of course, to make it happen. If there is a need that has to be addressed. Then we need to ask ourselves, are we ready to play the game? You know, are we ready to put our efforts and our money and our resources where it matters? And do we understand the global ecosystem in which we're operating? You know, carrots and sticks were mentioned. And I think the sticks, we can choose to put them domestically, or they will be put in front of us by our partners. You know, it's very simple. Transition or be transitioned, be phased out. That is really what's going to happen. You know, lose your access to markets, lose your access to finance. The same with the carrots. You know, often I hear, you know, arguments when we talk about subsidies or incentives. Well, you know, we can't afford it, and we already support those industries very much. And often that's true. There's industries, you know, like the automotive industry, that's already very supported and subsidized. But I don't think it makes much sense to say, well, you know, plain about whether or not we should kind of support those industries. It's important to look at what do we gain from the support that we provide, and what's the global ecosystem. You know, if we're serious about tapping into certain opportunities, we have to look at the competition. And the reality is that certainly when it comes to green technologies across the board, our competitors in the global north and in the global south are deploying the red carpet and providing as much incentive as they can afford. Okay. And we can say it's fair or not fair, but it's irrelevant. That's just the ecosystem in which we are operating. You know, often I've been asked, well, what do I think of new energy vehicle? What do I think of this technology? And I said, it's irrelevant what you think of it. What matters is that it's coming. What matters is how you react to it. You know, whether you like the technology or not, it doesn't matter. We all have our opinion, but it's not particularly important. So are we ready to play the game? Are we ready to to plan and put our money where it matters. And then if we are ready to play the game, then we'll say, well, what do we need to do? Well, what do we need to actually do to tap into those opportunities? If we look at renewable energy technologies as one example, of course, that is where the Renewable Energy Master Plan comes in. The global ecosystem and the domestic ecosystem is clear. It's a once-in-a-century growth path that we are experiencing, okay? Exponential growth, hockey stick kind of trajectory. You don't even see that once in a generation, okay? If you look at just solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, and inverters, which are those three components in a much broader and bigger value chain, that's $2.5 billion of imports by South Africa in the first half of this year, and $10 billion over the last 10 years, okay? So now that's the market. But then you have to say, okay, do we have, the right demand domestically? Is it continual demand? We haven't had that historically, okay? We now have that going forward, but we need to continue on that trajectory. If it only lasts for 6 months, then of course it's not enough. If you speak to any manufacturer, the first question they ask you is, what's the demand? Can you show me X amount of demand per year for the next 5 years? If you can't answer that question, end of discussion. No one's going to build an industry if there's no demand. If you can answer that question positively, then you're in business. You can ask further questions. Of course, it's not a silver bullet just to have the demand. Then we need, of course, reliable, affordable, low carbon electricity. That's obvious. But then we need the conducive ecosystem to be competitive. We need the trade and the industrial policy to be competitive. And that's when we go back to where does it make sense? What are the niches that make sense? And what are the incentives and programs that we can put in place to support anchor demand through our procurement in both public and private sector demand? Put the right incentives where we can. As tweak our trade policy where we can do that as well. It's important. I think we need to look at it. And of course, look at the broader ecosystem in terms of standards, R&D, skills, and the likes. And that's when we think about it in a slightly different way. Certainly when we look at renewable energy, we think solar panels. Solar panels is not the easiest of the slam dunks when it comes to localization. Certainly not, When we look at the value chain, there are many other opportunities that make a lot of sense, And it's the same with wind, it's the same with batteries, it's the same with our transmission infrastructure, which could support our steel industry massively. And so unpacking that is quite fundamental, I think, and understand where our niches are in those value chains. And this is just one example, is really, for me, is really the crux of it, to move beyond some of those, I would say, primary opportunities, which may or may not be relevant to South Africa, and that we start unpacking. And if we do that right, then we put our resources to it. There will be failures, we have to accept it, but at least we will be better equipped to seize the opportunities. And that's certainly what we're trying to do through the Renewable Energy Master Plan, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about it in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gaylor, bringing some realism into the conversation here. So we need the right to win, we need a right to play. So that's what I'm hearing. So I want to bring in our last panelist, Raula, if you can come through and share some of your opening remarks. I can see there's lots of conversations in the Q&A already starting. So I want to be able to get into it, but please do come in and share your thoughts.
Thank you, Shamini. I think at this point, with this specific panel of speakers, I'm very inclined to say ditto. all of the above. The points that we raised there, I can just as well, it's the discussions we've been having when we discuss about just energy transition, economic diversification, the role of local industry, the importance of trade in achieving just transition. So as I was looking at my notes, I was like, yes, this one, I agree. Yes, this one, I've also thought of this. There's so many things so many perspectives in this discussion of just energy transition and where the industrial development fits into that and what we should do. We need to realize that, and I might be repeating some of the items, but just to put my thoughts into an order. So yes, economic diversification is key to any success of just transition, but that also with a caveat, with a flag next to it. That economic diversification should not come at the expense of livelihoods and communities. By diversifying our economy, we can create new opportunities, but also we should not leave out the sectors that are already existing, like Gelo just said. We need to strike a balance between that, and that's the challenge, that's the difficulty into economic diversification. The extra challenge into that is that we put in the forefront fostering employment and income generating opportunities, but at the same time, we need to think of environmental goals and energy challenges. All of this together need to also strike a balance. The short-term solutions and strategies versus long-term strategies also need to strike a balance. We have many times discussions about jobs and how many jobs are going to be lost in the just energy transition and what we do with that. And then the question comes, I call that the $1 million question, is how many jobs are we prepared to lose today for saving the population and the jobs of the long term? Then we discussed the role of the local industry, and we should not overlook the potential that the local industry has. Again, need, requirement, potential, these are all sometimes interlinked. But we must recognize this uniqueness that these local actors are facing. Sometimes we think local industry and we forget the SMMEs. We look at the local manufacturing, the big actors. We forget the SMMEs. We tend to forget the informal sector of the economy that plays a big role to the South African economy and many African economies as well. And to cater to these needs of the local actors, we need to look at access to financial resources. We need to look at technical expertise. We need to find support, a way to support local industries where it makes sense. And then recently, we also get this feeling in all of these discussions and different conferences and platforms that there is a polarized view: local manufacturing or trading. So either I import or I manufacture locally, which I don't think it's a fair argument, because currently global economies do both. They find the opportunities and where the competitiveness, it's part of the discussion in the chat as well, where the competitiveness makes place, and see where it makes sense to trade and where it makes sense to develop a local manufacturing or to promote local manufacturing of all of these technologies. There's no either or. And again, it's the fine balance is the challenge there. So underlying to all of that, I'm going to give it with an asterisk here, is the skills, the development of skills. We discuss today until now, the engineer that has a place, and the intellectual property that has a place, and the technologist and the economist, and then. And we have some now, but which ones are we going to need in the future, and how many are we going to need in the future? What kind of skills are we going to need in the future? And the question I'm posing here is, are we preparing for that? Are we, as we talk about economic clusters, is this economic clusters preparing for what we're going to need in the future, the kind of engineer we're going to need in the future, for example? So I have three things, and one is the skill shortages to mention, because we tend in these discussions to, sometimes it feels like we repeat ourselves, we say what needs to be done. But then I go into class, and when I speak about that with my students, the students are asking, but why is it not done then? We all agree that it needs to be done, but why is it not? What stops us? What are the hurdles put into all of that? The one is infrastructure deficiencies, right? That's a significant challenge to industrial development, and that's a systemic type of thinking of investment into infrastructure, and then infrastructure will bring back, and the better infrastructure will attract more investment. Better infrastructure will improve the business environment, but in order to improve the infrastructure, we need to have a better business environment. So again, there's chicken and egg situation there. Second, regulatory complexity, bureaucracy, institution, that doesn't allow this positive circle to kick in. Because it is a circle, and the moment you put a hurdle there, it stops, everything stops moving. So ideas would be, let's discuss how to streamline regulatory processes, how to reduce red tape, how to ensure that there is a consistent enforcement of rules and critical steps to improve this ease of doing business in South Africa. We need that. We need that for the private sector also to contribute into that positive circle we want to ignite. Transparency goes without saying. All of these things will help this this positive circle. And I'm gonna finish again with the mentioning of skills. Skilled labor, technical STEM fields. And we heard from fellow panelist Chakani, she spoke about the women's involvement there. Who is skilled and who we should upskill and who we should reskill. This shortage of skills or shortage of the appropriate skills can hinder economic growth, and then the circle stops again, the wheel stops again. We have disparities in the educational system, limited access to quality education for a big majority of our population. Maybe let me not say big majority, but big part of our population. We have, they haven't even heard the skills that are needed for that. So these skills gaps require comprehensive reforms in the education sector and the vocational training programs to bridge all of this, what the industry needs with what kind of skills we produce for the future economy to work. All of that requires partnerships. It requires collaboration. So I cannot sit at the university and say, I know what skills the industry actually needs. And the industry cannot sit on their side and say, but we are not getting the skills because the universities are not giving them to us. We need to work together for these things to move forward. And bigger than that, we need, I like the idea of strategic planning. It's not skills for the sake of skills, or it's not growth for the sake of growth. Planning, targeted investments in things that are gonna yield positive results in the long term. And with that, I'm gonna stop the summary here of my fellow speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rola. You're breaking up a little bit. Apologies if I cut you off. Just a quick one. So I just want to check with you. I mean, you mentioned strategic planning, and that came up even with Charles, where he spoke about this different way of thinking. Maybe just very quickly encapsulate what you're actually referring to. What is strategic planning, and how is it different to the planning we do today?
My internet is a bit unstable, so if I break, you know.
No problem.
Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Maybe put your camera off because it is breaking up a little bit.
Okay, maybe that's better like that. Yeah. So strategic planning, I think strategic planning comes from a bigger collaboration of different sectors. Strategic planning comes from getting out from voting circles, election cycles. So when I speak about strategic planning, my mind goes, or what I refer to is proper future planning, taking into consideration constraints, opportunities, and contributions from the different actors within the system. Trying to find out who does what in a most competitive, efficient manner, so that we use that contribution above some non-efficient way of that contribution that comes from another entity. So I think what we're lacking is that concerted effort to do things together. And that, I mean, the PCC is an effort, some other efforts have been done recently. We need to start thinking long-term. We need to start thinking possible sacrifices in the short term, but sacrifices that make sense and that we are prepared for. There's no change that will happen that will not have winners and losers. There's nowhere in the history of human being a technological intervention came in and there were not people that lost their jobs. I mean, think of cell phones and landlines to start with, but all technological interventions had created winners and losers. Strategic planning means I can identify the, in inverted commas, losers and be prepared for that.
Thanks for that, Ralda, to just clear it up with me. But I mean, you mentioned something about winners and losers. I want to take us a step back and really maybe Gaylor and a few others that have been part and parcel of some sort of foundational work that's been done in this space is, you know, we talk about these major shifts. We heard Sakani mention the automotive sector. We know about the coal sector, but what are some of the major trade and industrial shifts? Very clearly, very succinctly, so that our audience can understand, what are we anticipating to happen? Clearly, we're moving away from coal. We are going to see a move to electric vehicles, but what else is really happening and shaping industrial policy in South Africa? So maybe Gaylor, if you can start us off, I'm picking on you because I know you've done some work here on this space, and maybe Dr. Zalk, if you can come in there after as well, given you've got to leave just now. So Gaylor, maybe if we can start off with you.
Yeah, thanks, Shamini. And I think, you know, I think the first big shift to acknowledge, and I think it has big implications in the way we deal with the transition, is the technological evolution that we see in our energy system. But I feel like too often we want to have one answer for two intertwined but different transition. And what I mean by that is we have our energy system that is transitioning currently from carbon intensive to low carbon technologies. It's not the first transition in the energy system over time, but it is happening at the moment. And that means that, you know, we are transitioning our energy systems to new technologies because they are more cost effective, and of course they come with other benefits. Then there's a broader economic and society-wide transition that is happening that is connected to it, but is distinct in many respects. And we see that certainly in the debate around the transition in the coal fields and, you know, the move from coal to renewable energy. And I feel like we want one answer for both those transitions. So we say, well, the transition in the energy level is from coal to renewable energy, so we must invest in renewable energy, but that must also answer the economic transition. And the transition in terms of employment and investment and trade opportunities. But of course, this is not as simple. And I think we need two answers. We need an answer at the technological level where we're transitioning our energy system. And that's what we're seeing now with massive investment in renewable energy and shift to more kind of decentralized energy system. And then we need an answer for the sort of economy-wide transition that's happening and the employment transition that is occurring. Of course, renewable energy investment is part of that answer, but it's only a part of that answer. And I think the narrative that one that is currently employed in the coal value chain will now be employed in renewable energy value chain makes no sense, honestly. It just makes no sense. Some people who currently work in the coal value chain will be employed in the renewable energy value chain. Yes. But the idea that everyone in one sector must be in a transition to another holds no value whatsoever. Okay. What is required is a multifaceted response to that transition so that we see an answer on the employment front for those communities and people employed in those jobs. And so we must answer that for the transitions of the sectors that are going to be progressively phased out. But realistically, it's not that many sectors that are going to be phased out. It's primarily fossil fuels, effectively, in some shape or form, or coal and liquid fuels that are going to be effectively phased out. But again, this is a long-term transition that's happening over a number of decades, and we need an answer to that. But most sectors effectively are not being phased out, but they're being heavily changed. They are transformed. And we see that, of course, through the way the production processes are being shifted, consumer choices are being shifted, investment chances are being shifted. And here we we need a different answer about how do we transition the existing sectors and support the technological shift and the skills transition that's required in those sectors. And so I think we need to start unpacking those different transitions that are happening. Often we lump them as one. It's just one transition, and then we're gonna have one magic, solution, one silver bullet that's gonna solve it all. But sadly, there's no such thing. It's not one investment in one technology, be it renewable energy, be it NEV, be it green hydrogen, be it whatever we want, that's gonna solve all our problems. And if we unpack the transition at the energy level, the transition in the sectors that are going to be phased out, because some will be, and most importantly, the transition in all the sectors that are going to be transformed, then we can have a shot at answering the question. And of course, then we have to bring all the rest of the economy along that is not necessarily experiencing a direct transition, but is impacted in the long run.
No, thanks for that, Gelo. I'd like to bring Dr. Nimrod in. Any sort of further insights on what Gelo has said, perhaps from a trade perspective?
Look, I think Gelo's touched on the big picture, which is that the international trading system, in many ways, is actually being fundamentally changed. So, I think what we're seeing globally is a kind of interface of a response to climate change, the reconfiguration of global value chains, geopolitical shifts, and not all of these things are necessarily being motivated by kind of wanting to respond positively to climate change. A significant part of what's happening is driven by the EU and the US wanting to be less reliant on China on the one hand, for key technology, and for the EU, less reliant on Russia for energy. I think, though, that we need to understand those shifts, but I think we need to focus our attention and our energies very much on what do they mean for opportunities that we can unlock, while recognizing that there is a lot of inequity in a lot of this transition. So I think the key thing really for us is to say, what are the things that we really can do? What should we focus on? And again, some of it is also, having a degree of realism about, where we can play in some of these new technologies, kind of in the near future, and recognizing that some of them it's going to be exceptionally difficult. But part of it is, also recognizing the areas that are right under our noses, that we haven't paid attention to, adequate attention to. So again, I would highlight the gross kind of overlooking of agriculture, particularly the kind of high value agriculture that I highlighted. I mean, this is an enormous opportunity, and South Africa has positioned itself as a world leader in the space. And we essentially, it's a market where there is no constraint, there's no demand constraint. We can sell as much as we can produce of these kind of products. I mean, there's a term that's been coined, the industrialization of freshness. Delivering fresh fruits, high quality horticultural products to an enormous market, both in the north and rapidly growing upper middle class in the east. I think first of all, let's play to our strengths as a number one principle. I think a second issue is, the global trading system, the World Trade Organization is essentially is almost defunct, and the reason is that the advanced economies that have for decades told developing countries, you shouldn't intervene in markets, you shouldn't distort markets, are now implementing the most enormous subsidies, like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And so we need to be alive to that. We can't match what is being provided, but we also need to say, look, what can we do? And let's not be blinded by an absolute blanket view that there's nothing that we can do on the fiscal front. I think that there's a very important measure that we can take, and it's highlighted in the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, which is to really look closely at using our tax regime. The one term I've heard is hacking the tax code. So, putting in place tax, attractive tax measures that are selective and are very tightly targeted at key parts of the value chain where we think we can become competitive. So it could be in parts of the battery mineral space. It could be in electrolyzers that are needed for making green hydrogen. It could be in relation to particular parts of the platinum group metal fuel cell space. And there's no immediate fiscal cost, because you are only providing a benefit to an investment that will create and enable new value chain or new value chain opportunities. And if it doesn't, then it simply just doesn't get get subsidized. So you know, I think that to me that is a very, very significant part of consideration. I mean, another consideration I would say is, you know, how do we economize on? We know that it's really expensive, and that you know, haven't had a fantastic track record in building mega infrastructure projects. You know, leaving aside the kind of rent seeking and state capture. How do we economize and really use the infrastructure that we already have available? So, you know, how, for instance, might we build, you know, a hub around, say, OR Tambo that produces clean aviation fuel that allows us to, you know, really, you know, create an aviation hub that supports long-haul tourism in the region? How do we, for instance, use the resources that we have in the Northern Cape, say the solar resources, to produce, if not, you know, at a minimum, green iron out of the iron ore that we hold in the Northern Cape, and use the existing rail routes and linkages that we have to the coast, to Saldanha and so forth. So I think those are some of the things that we really need to be, you know, thinking about, and paying perhaps a lot more attention to that kind of nitty-gritty, and less to, you know, some of the, either lamenting the unfairness of the world, you know, trading system, or, you know, some of the more pie in the sky kind of ideas that, you know, that look very attractive, but, you know, but technologically, you know, may be, you know, just beyond our reach right now as a country. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nimrod. I'm not sure if you are able to stay with us a little bit longer. It is 17 minutes past 12.
I'm afraid not. I'll leave it to my other esteemed panelists to take all the tough questions.
Thank you, Doctor. It was really good to have you as part of the panel and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Shamini.
I think what we've heard already from Gelo is that there are shifts happening. There's industrial shifts, there's trade shifts, but as was said by Nimrod, there's a lot of opportunities in this space and things that are under our noses. We've also got mechanisms where we can incentivize industrial development because it's needed. We have to not be left behind as a country as this shift is happening. I want to now touch on Joanne, and I want to ask a question of you, and then I'm just going to get the audience ready to start asking their questions as well thereafter. But Joanne, can you help us? How is the capital markets moving? How are the banks thinking about these new sectors? Are the financial flows moving into this direction to start, you know, getting projects off the ground and new sectors off the ground? Over to you, Joanne.
Thanks so much. And I think the benefit we have in the transition is that the REAP program has built a lot of appetite in investors for renewable energy assets. So we're seeing, particularly around the corporate build, that we're seeing similar pricing to what was achieved through the REAP program, particularly for large corporates building. So there is significant bank appetite for the infrastructure-related aspects of the just transition. Where we see significantly less appetite is in the proving new technology. The IDC remains one of the few players in the market that funds project development, which is what is critically needed in a lot of the new innovations. We do see great value in the grants that are part of the climate deal in order to de-risk blended finance vehicles, in order to scale up the level of funding that's available for this early stage development. Because without us taking early risk in proving technologies, we are going to be left behind. But we're seeing that there is significant foreign interest and appetite in these new technologies, a lot of corporate appetite in the new technologies. But it is going to take a while for the institutional and bank market to actually look at funding some of the new technologies. So we do need to think about, we've mentioned, or we haven't mentioned here, but we've recently launched the H2 Global Fund, which is a green hydrogen fund with the support of the Dutch government. and being a blended finance vehicle with the Dutch government providing a first loss position, it does provide the potential for commercial investors to come in on the back of the concessional and DFI funding. So I think we just need to be smart about how we leverage capital into the higher risk portions of the industrial development. Even on the manufacturing side, we're seeing a lot of appetite for the large corporates who can fund themselves quite easily. But there still seems to be a lack of understanding and risk appetite for supporting SMEs and businesses in the manufacturing sector. So we definitely need to see more innovation in the bank funding markets to ensure that we do properly enable the growth of the value chains to support the large green transition.
Interesting you say that, Joanne, because, you know, coming from the business sector, the thing that's interesting is that there's a lot of projects, there's a lot of ideas, but none of them make economic sense at this point. So we need subsidies, we need the grants. But I think one of the other things that's so critically important, and maybe Charles, you can come in here, is the partnerships and collaboration to spread the risk. You know, you spoke a little bit about turning this on its head. You know, what types of partnerships are needed? You know, what kind of innovation in that space is needed? So Charles, maybe you can shed some light on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the first thing that we need to focus is on new partnerships and new business models between government and private sector. I think if we don't take hands, we are not going to move forward. There's this big trust deficit between the two sides of the coin, unfortunately, and the only way that we are going to move forward is to actually get is to overcome this trust deficit. And in some cases, the best way of overcoming the trust deficit is through some sort of new business model where there's a new type of venture or triple P that allows the investors to put in money into a venture without worrying about the transparency of this investment. So I think that is the one thing. The second thing is that we have to start working much closer together as industry across sectors, but also in the same sector. And I think that is what is now driving a lot of the changes, is because everybody understands they can't do it alone. I think if you start just looking at things like, if we just take the mining sector, which is actually quite large in Mpumalanga, if we start looking at the amount of funding that's allocated to SLPs, the social and labor plans, as well as the amount of funding allocated to enterprise and supply development, there's actually billions and billions of rands that is spent on an annual basis that can be channeled in appropriate ways if we have a common plan of how we want to channel it. Obviously, there's also some legislation processes behind these things in terms of the license to operate. That and yet again, we need to then look at the policies and processes to enable flow of funding that is already there, because the funding is there. It is just about aligning it and allowing industry to spend it in a different way. So, of course, and we should not forget communities. So I think in many of these cases, especially in terms of the conversations in Mpumalanga, many of the communities has been left behind. And we cannot move ahead if we do not incorporate the views and aspirations, because everybody has aspirations. And how do we incorporate those aspirations and to a large extent the capability and capacity of these communities? So we for example, in the past have done capacity assessments in communities, understanding the skills and the aspirations of these communities and how to empower that to actually create a new wave of energy. We in South Africa cannot create a job for every single person. That is impossible. And even in some cases, it's even more impossible because government tries to create jobs, industry tries to create jobs, and we're not working together. But it's impossible to create jobs for everyone. But we can create empowerment. So how do we empower people to take their destiny in their own hands? How do we create the hope and aspirations for people to stand up and start actively working on their own futures? And that is part of what we need to do in the community base is to start igniting the fire. And the only way to ignite the fire is to create this aspiration and say, well, there is hope and there is a future. And what is this common future that everybody working towards? Because that is, unfortunately, as I said previously, the narrative is missing, because it's very difficult rallying people around problems. Everybody, there's problems everywhere, and what we've tried to do, nobody's done before. There has been transitions and reindustrialization, but with a completely different political context, economic context, and social context. So what we're trying to do is so complex, and there is going to be mistakes made. And I think we need to acknowledge is that if you do something new, there's no recipe book. There is going to be mistakes, as part of this process, there's going to be faults, but we don't want to rally people around problems. We want to rally people around the future. So create that aspirational view of the future, and what everybody buys in. That is going to bind people to work together towards the future. And I think as soon as we have that, because that creates also the common narrative of where we're going to collectively, that is going to completely change the face of the country.
No, thanks for that, Charles. And really good to know that there are organizations that are looking to empower, because, you know, we often hear about how do we create jobs, but we don't talk about the enabling environment to empower people to do this for themselves as well. Sekani, you spoke a lot about this, about, you know, communities and looking at economic clusters differently. Is there anything you want to bring around some of those examples regarding localization and seeing communities develop in this space? Do you want to come through, Sekani?
Thank you, Shamini. I think in practical terms, what's need to happen is that it's a fact we're going to have imported. My apologies. We're going to have imported technology that will be obviously in transforming our carbon-intensive economy. We'll have imported technology from outside the country. We'll also have big corporates who will bring technology into communities. I think what we are saying is that enterprise development it's critical. So there has to be meaningful participation of local SMEs to grow the local economy. So I think it's one thing that we definitely need to ensure that it's part of the play. Because you can create jobs, but obviously, you cannot create jobs without, creating and empowering the local economy through capacity building, through meaningful inclusion of SMEs as part of the mix. And again, I think, let me just mention this as well, because I think it was mentioned by several of my panelists. It is a fact that as we transition, jobs will be lost in the short term. I think we, as a country, both the public and the private, we haven't looked at the plan as to how do we ensure that the transition is just. So obviously, as you lose jobs in the primary industry, how do you then create, other new clusters within that economy? So what I've seen at times is that we do not plan well in advance. And when people are displaced from their jobs, you find that in terms of training, we might not be adequately ready. also in the creation of those other businesses. Just to give an example, if, for example, you want to assist people to form a co-op and maybe develop a garden, it cannot be the type of garden that will only serve, you know, their families. You have to look at the skills. You have to scale it. You have to assist them with the market needs. You have to assist them to access, because there are programs. There are programs in the, you know, in departments. So I think that part is one thing that we haven't done well, so that, you know, we don't find a particular industry or economic or a community operating a silo, but, you know, to ensure that there's collaboration across at local level, sectoral level, regional level, to ensure that we really create new businesses where jobs will be lost. I think it's a consequence of transformation. We cannot run away from that. Thank you, Shamini.
Thank you for that, Tsakani. I've got a hand up and I want to invite the audience now. Landiwe, you had a few questions in the Q&A, so I want to just tee you up to come in after Leanne, but let me open up to the audience now. Leanne, if you can come through and ask your question, please.
Thank you, Shamini, and thank you to the panel. This is a really interesting discussion, and I hope you can all hear me properly. There seems to be a bit of background noise. Well, I want to maybe say, you know, to Gaylo's comments around developing parallel solutions and the need to develop parallel solutions and to recognize the complexity with what we're dealing with. Now, I completely agree with that, you know, and I think I do want to say, though, that in doing so and recognizing the complexity, we also can't come up with plans that potentially undermine each other or displace the prioritization of sectors that need more urgent support over others, right? So maybe I can give an example, and the panel can come in with some answers or reflections. Let's take, for example, gas and gas exploration and development in South Africa. The PCC has already said we need you know, about 3 to 5 gigawatts of peaking support at very low utilization in terms of gas requirements. So in terms of power generation, very little need there in terms of gas. But the IDC is in fact supporting both Renergen and Kinetico, Kinetico being an Australian company, for massive gas developments. And I would like to better understand how we are justifying massive gas development, especially for export, in the context of the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan saying we need to foster demand. And, you know, it's literally the SAREM starts off by saying that RE provides the least cost avenue to generate electricity, and that supporting local demand for RE is critical. So do these work together? How is that being justified by the IDC in particular in supporting these developments, or the DMRE, which has both released the SAREM and is issuing these gas licenses, right? So I would be interested in that reflection. The second is around green hydrogen. And, you know, I think we all understand the application of green hydrogen for the steel sector, for example. And I think the one thing I do want to say is I think we should very quickly retire the term hard to abate for the steel sector. I think the steel sector has increasingly shown itself to be quite, to have really interesting technological changes that are applicable. Green hydrogen seems to be very useful and important for an application in the steel industry, but not so important for broader power generation needs. And so I would really like to understand the panel's view on developing a broader green hydrogen economy in that context. And, you know, if we take the steel sector, so that's the one question. The second one is, if we take the steel sector, for example, and going back to Princess Tsakani's point around subsidies, it would seem that steel is much easier to abate than we imagine, that they need green hydrogen for that particular application. You could co-locate renewable energy plants But that seems like something the steel industry needs to be doing, but that government cannot afford the subsidies required to do that. So, potentially the ArcelorMittal Group can come in and provide that support, or I would be interested in the panel's views on how then do you support the steel industry that is so vital to this broader transformation, given that government really cannot afford subsidies at this point, and that the JEDP, for example, has other urgent priorities that it needs to be addressing. Yeah, I think I will end my questions there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm going to see which of the panelists. Joanne, are you back? You needed to step out, so I'm just checking if you're back. Perhaps Gaylor, anyone else want to weigh in on the questions from Leanne?
Thanks. I did miss the first part of the question, but I'm happy to pick up on the green hydrogen side. And I have been the chair of the Green Hydrogen Panel, which has developed the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy. And I think it's critical to understand that green hydrogen is not a priority from a commercialization strategy perspective as an energy alternative. It is a priority from an industrial pathway. So it does provide, I think there's often comments made that it's a very inefficient electricity substitute, and it is. It's never intended to be an electricity substitute. However, one of the benefits of the generation of green hydrogen in the identified nodes, specifically in the Northern Cape, Western Cape, and Eastern Cape, is that it will assist with the electrification of those communities, which will be remote from the grid for probably the next decade, given the level of work that's required on the grid. And also provides a level of storage capacity that will support stability of those regional grids. So there definitely are energy benefits that flow from hydrogen, but the objective of hydrogen is not energy in and of itself. If we look at the South African petrochemicals industry, I mean, we have Sasol today produces 2.4 million tons per annum of hydrogen. So it is something that we have good experience in as a country, even though it is predominantly in a company. And I think 2.4 million tons is what we plan as the initial export pathway on green hydrogen. And there's often a question as to why would we export? Why would we take our critical electrons and export them to emerging economies? And it is specifically to take advantage of those contract for differences. So the subsidies effectively available in the Asian and European markets that assist us in building a green hydrogen economy in South Africa. And the green hydrogen economy is focused on creating meaningful jobs and quality employment within the green hydrogen value chain. It assists us in the beneficiation of our platinum group resources, which would be used both in the fuel cells as well as in the electrolyzers. So it is a beneficiation pathway for our platinum group metals. The opportunities from a sustainable aviation fuel perspective are significant. I mean, we do have the proprietary, sorry, Shamini, I'm really selling Sasol here. Now, we have the proprietary Fischer-Tropsch technology that South Africa has largely developed, and I'll declare IDC's interest. We did start Sasol in the 1950s, so we are still heavily invested in Sasol, and Sasol remains a critical asset to decarbonize. I mean, it is a large investment of ours, so decarbonization of Sasol as well as decarbonization of the ArcelorMittal and the broader steel industry is a critical priority, and hydrogen is the key enabler to assisting that. If we look at the aviation, I've mentioned aviation fuel, the marine bunkering fuel, South Africa's position on the southern tip of Africa along a series of trade routes, our opportunity to play competitively in that space is significant. An additional exporting industry, well, I suppose, is it an export? No, it would be consumed on our coast. But it would be an enabler to decarbonized shipping. It also would assist in decarbonizing the transport pathways of South African goods and products that are destined for the export market. So the enabling opportunity from hydrogen in creating industrial pathways is significant, which is what makes green hydrogen interesting. So I think it's really important for those of you who haven't read it, please have a look at the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy, which is available. There's a summary document available. because the priority of it is about the industrial pathways and new export potential, new tax potential, new job potential that it delivers, as opposed to limiting the conversation to energy. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanne. Just the first part of Leanne's question was related to gas exploration, was directed directly at the IDC in terms of the fact that we shouldn't have policies or interventions in place that maybe counteract each other and put ourselves in a position where we might not be able to transition effectively to net zero. So just some reflections on gas exploration and why that's still being pushed, given the fact that even the PCC has recommended that it would be peaking support that's needed, and it could be in the form of, for example, utilizing gas. So just any view on that?
So gas exploration, I think, remains a hotly contested topic around Africa, particularly with the significant deposits that have been found off the coast of Africa. From our perspective, we will support gas into existing pathways. The biggest risk with gas is the risk of stranded assets. And I think we do have an organizational view. We will, as the IDC, support gas projects provided there is limited risk of stranded assets. From my perspective, I believe it is a transitional fuel. I think that there's a key role for gas to play during the transition. But where it comes to the future of energy sources, I think that the future is wide open. I think that there is a lot of technological advancement that is necessary within green hydrogen and other fuel sources. And it's going to be a very interesting space to watch, particularly in Africa's development. We've seen in Namibia, one of the largest green hydrogen projects announced and one of the largest gas resources identified. What does the country do? Because gas and oil will continue to be part of the energy mix over the next 2 decades. So I think that it remains a space that we need to be long-term focused in, but flexible in our short-term approach would be my view. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Joanne. Gaylor, Landiwe has had to leave. I'm just wondering if this question, you'd be able to provide a response. How do we reach a critical mass of green production to sustain the level of economic growth that's needed for the transition? Any perspective on that? How do we get that going in the country?
Thanks for the input and the questions. And look, I think it really depends on obviously what technology we're talking about. But I think when it comes to the energy side of it, certainly I think we need to really reckon with the size of the investment that is required. Okay, and I think we fail to realize in the scale of the investment in renewable energy that we are about to embark upon as a country. And in terms of what's required, if we are serious about energy security, which seems like a no-brainer, and secondly, if we want to tap into opportunities like green hydrogen and others, we're looking at increasing our grid, the size of our grid, by times 4 or 5, effectively, over the next few decades. And that's, from about 45 gigawatts to anywhere between 200 to 250. So that's massive investment in the transmission and the distribution infrastructure that's required if we are really serious about that. I mean, we already know it's very constrained in terms of our development, with our Cape provinces not having sufficient grid available. But we also need the market and the policy infrastructure to be enabling, because the trend that we see now, we have an investment that's effectively concentrated directly from either direct procurement from the state or now private companies investing directly on their balance sheet or through direct transactions in terms of long-term power purchase agreement. That's going to become very constrained going forward. no company, in the country can go and build tens and tens of gigawatts of renewable energy on their own. No, this is just not possible. Okay, that's not possible for any company, any industrial company to do that. And so we're gonna need transmission infrastructure. We're gonna need the market infrastructure. We're gonna need to unlock, I think, the opportunities as well for everyone else to invest, communities, households, and SMMEs and the like. More broadly, though, and I think that speaks to the previous questions as well, we need to understand the technological pathways and how they land themselves into South Africa. And I think we need to reckon, with some of those difficult questions. If we think about green steel, for instance, technologies to decarbonize the steel industry exist. And I would agree that it's not, we need to move away with terms like hard to abate. I mean, there's a technological pathway. The question is not whether the technology exists. The question is, how does this technology land in South Africa? And that pathway is not obvious in the South African context at all. At all. ArcelorMittal, yes, has the technology at a global level. But what does it take for South Africa to get ArcelorMittal to invest in that technology in South Africa? They don't have to. I mean, they can go and invest it everywhere in the world. And so, there's certainly potential around Saldanha and things like this, but it's not obvious. And what about the other players? Some are partly state-owned, some are fully private, but do they have access to that technology? No, they're much smaller companies. And so if they don't have access to the technology and the IP to do that, then what is their future? And I think we need to reckon with that sort of technological pathway going forward in a lot of different sectors. It's also valid, for no energy vehicle and many others. And that, lastly, need to think about how we link those developments to the broader economy. And I think that ties in with any technological development that we see. If it's going to develop as an enclave for one company or one facility without deep linkages with the rest of the economy, then we're not going to get the benefits as much as we could. And I think that's some of the risk around green hydrogen, certainly, but also some of this technological development that they develop themselves as enclaves. They happen to be in South Africa, but they could be anywhere, and then you don't want that. You want to really get the linkages with this going forward.
Okay, thanks for that, Gelo. Clement, can we bring Clement onto the floor in Thabiseng? He has 2 or 3 questions. I'd like him to ask them direct. Clement?
Am I audible? Good afternoon.
You are.
Okay. Yes, I would like to touch on our industrial policies, because our industrial policies were not meant for what we call just transition, to change, because it was being produced and being done by the fossil fuels. Now, in this era, 21st century era, we have to change to the new renewables, and our demand and also the population have increased. And so far, now we have to adapt and change to the new industrial revolution, because for now, our demand it's confusing for also the upcoming industrial projects. And also we have to have this complex of having people to know that our industrial policies have to be amended, because the national framework, which was done 2009 until 2019, is not also been reviewed, so that it must adjust with the new just transition framework that we are busy right on with now. Because even the PCC, for them to understand all the things, the policies have to change, because even the food scheme policies, every department, every sphere have to change all the policies, because the main thing is industrial, to get our commodities as South African through the outside developed countries. We have to be competent, and we have to challenge our capabilities with our resources that we have, so that we must be on the developed stage where our policies are being internationalized and globalized, not only because we produce our local, and our local produce is not being high valued to the global countries. But we need to improve and support our proudly South African resources, so that we also, our industrial policies have to be recognized globally, not us depending on outside countries bringing the technology. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, I was just hoping we can get someone to respond. So we've got 10 minutes, so apologies for that, Clement, but I'd like to get the panelists to maybe respond to you. What I'm hearing you say is that, you know, policies across the board need to change. How do we effect that change? So perhaps, Sakani, I can ask you to start, and if you can be brief, so at least we can respond to one other question as well. So maybe, Sakani, if you can come through, and maybe then we can open up to Joanne and Gaylo as well.
Thank you, Shamini. I think that is the purpose of today's engagement. It's our industrial policy as it is fit for purpose. What shifts are needed to ensure that the trade policy as we have it in South Africa responds to the transition. I think we've answered it in bits and pieces, but what is important is that departments cannot afford to work in silos. That is why we've got the DDIC, we've got the IDC, which obviously would ensure that, you know, all the departments work together to achieve our goal of transition. Just maybe to mention a few things that have to be part of that policy. For example, already we've mentioned the issue of domestic, measures. What needs to happen in the industrial policy of the country, and we've mentioned. I think all of us have mentioned, different aspects of it. What needs to happen within our domestic policy? That we need to ensure that we have incentives, as expensive as that is, as constraints as our fiscal is. We'll have to find a way of ensuring that there are incentives. There are also tariffs that will assist that transition. Also, finance also, it's an important part, and I'm glad that the minister now, Minister Barbara Creecy, has emphasized the need for non-finance instruments, so that as a country, we not always have to use our sovereign guarantee. So I think what he's trying to do is to make sure that, across, when we borrow money as a country, it's not too expensive, and there's a bigger portion of grants, and the non-finance instrument will come in the form of technologies and other means. So also as a country, as a member of the BRICS country, we're talking about the one currency. So those are the issues that need to be there. They are still all over the place, but those are the issues that need to be brought together to inform the new shift that will allow us as a country to be competitive. Obviously, broader cooperation, we've spoken about that will assist us in terms of capacity building, in terms of learning from other countries. So that broader cooperation as well has to be part of I think it is part of the policy, but we just have to make sure that we intensify that, because now when you talk about transition, now it's technology that other countries obviously they started long before us. So we need to benefit from that international framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakani. Shaw, we've got 2 or 3 questions from Bongani, and I think it's important that we respond to these. Do you want to maybe come in and help us with that response in terms of Are the steel and chemical engineering sectors going at speed with plans of the just transition? And then Joanne, if you could help us very quickly with a response in terms of, does the framework, the just transition framework, accommodate the introduction of hydrogen in line with water demand, which is a challenge in South Africa, given also climate change? So maybe if we can open up to Charles first, and then we can move to Joanne quickly in 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, it is a very difficult question. I think fundamentally, and I need to pick the right words now so that I don't land up in trouble, because sometimes I do land up in trouble, is that I do think the conversations around the just transition has derailed the conversations around the fourth industrial revolution. If you look pre-COVID, there was a significant amount of discussions around the embracement of the fourth industrial revolution and how do we create more competitive industries by digitizing industries to not deindustrialize as quickly as we currently are. Unfortunately, the conversation of digitization has been taken over by the conversation about decarbonization. And these two things are hand in hand. So the reason why I'm saying that is that I still do think if we just finished a study for our training center that we want to launch in 2 or 3 of the provinces. And if you start looking at the skills levels, we're actually far behind. The skills to digitize is not there. Engineering skills, we do have very good engineers. We don't deliver enough. But also we need artisans and other technicians that actually support the fourth industrial revolution, and our embracement of that and transitioning the curriculums into something a bit more relevant for the fourth industrial revolution has been very slow.
Thank you for that, Charles. Joanne, if you can respond quickly on the hydrogen.
Thanks. The water cost. So there are some studies that show that hydrogen consumes less water than certain fossil fuel-based energy and power-based systems. But to talk specifically to green hydrogen, which is obviously the splitting of the water into hydrogen and oxygen as a byproduct. The cost of desalination is a small overall cost in the cost of green hydrogen production. So the benefit for remote or not remote, water scarce communities like the Eastern Cape, there could be water benefits, water security benefits flowing from green hydrogen production as opposed to water deficit. If we look at some of the hydrogen projects that are being pursued in the Northern Cape, those are being pursued off the back of industrial wastewater as opposed to fresh water. So I do believe that green hydrogen can contribute to treatment of industrial wastewater and not negatively impact the water sources available in the country. And it goes back to my early statement. We need integrated planning. We really do need to understand how this the circle of success will actually work, consider the circular economy, understand the interlinkages, and ensure that we plan for positive environmental and social impact while growing our economy and our jobs. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Joanne. And now we've reached the end of our time contract. I mean, this dialogue is very interesting and really has a lot of key issues that sort of interplay across the economy, across different spheres of government, different role players. As you can see, not an easy discussion, but a discussion that needs to be had. Either way, the recording will be available and work needs to be done at the PCC in terms of the implementation plan. We've got a minute and I'm going to ask Galo 1 sentence in terms of a closing remark from you, Joanne and Charles, and we can close the session. 1 sentence, what sticks out for you?
Yeah, I think, look, thanks so much. It was really great discussion. And I think as a closing remark for me is that we can plan. That's really important. We need to do the master plan. We need to do the policies. But honestly, that's just a ticket to the game. If we want to play the game, we need to implement. We need to get going. we have wiggle room. I think Nimrod's made it, in terms of financings, and we have to be able to find that. So I think let's seize the opportunities where they are and implement our policies.
Thank you, Joanne. One sentence, please.
Thanks. I'm going to echo Gaylord. It really is, I think it's a time of no regret decisions that need to be actively pursued. The only way we ensure that the funding available for the green economy flows into South Africa is by demonstrating that we're building a green economy. So action, action, action.
Thank you, Joanne. Charles.
I think it's very. I think what both the previous speakers said is actually very true. We need to move, and we need to move at speed, and we need to prioritize in terms of what needs to be done. And unfortunately, as we said, there's always going to be winners and losers. So we need to, in terms of prioritization, make sure that we have some sort of evaluation framework that makes decisions very quickly through multiple parties and move and implement.
Thank you, Charles. Sakani.
For me, I think what came out very clearly today is that a transition, energy transition and economic transition are not the same. And I think that's what we discuss all the time, the Commission. So we just have to make sure that that economic transition happens. Obviously, it will be through what we've been discussing today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sakani. Thank you to all of the panelists, to the audience. Thank you to everyone who participated. We look forward to further engagements. Please do check the PCC events list. There will be more of these conversations. And quite right, we have to move forward. The transition is happening and we need to be prepared. Thank you to everyone. Session is closed.
Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you.